The whip of rain against the stable roof was the only warning Elsie Cartwright had before she heard the whimper. She had been carrying a bucket of feed across the yard when the sound reached her, thin and broken, almost lost beneath the storm. She stopped. Rain soaked through her thin shawl and ran down the back of her neck, but she stood still, listening. There it was again. A small, desperate cry coming from behind the woodpile near the old carriage house. She set the bucket down and moved toward the sound, her boots sinking into the mud with every step. The wind pulled at her shawl, and thunder rolled somewhere far off across the hills, but the small cry came again, closer this time, pulling her forward like a thread she could not ignore. She had learned, in her years at the estate, to keep her head down and her steps quiet, to notice nothing that was not her business. But something about that sound would not let her walk away. Behind a stack of broken crates, half buried in wet leaves, she found a puppy. It was small, its fur matted with blood and dirt, one back leg twisted at a wrong angle. It looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes, and tried to crawl away, but it could not move far. Elsie knelt beside it without thinking of the cold seeping through her skirt. She had grown up with little kindness shown to her, and she knew what it was to be small and hurt and alone. She reached out slowly, letting the puppy smell her hand before she touched it. It trembled but did not bite. "You poor thing," she whispered. "Who did this to you?" She wrapped the puppy in the edge of her shawl and carried it close to her chest, shielding it from the rain as best she could. It was lighter than she expected, its small body shaking against hers, its heartbeat quick and frightened beneath the thin covering of fur. The estate where she worked, belonging to Lady Constance Merrick, was not a place that tolerated softness. Elsie knew this better than anyone. She had scars beneath her sleeves that told the story of a house run on fear rather than kindness. She had arrived there as a girl of 13 with no family left to claim her, and in the years since, she had learned to make herself small, to move through her days without drawing notice. But she could not leave the puppy to die in the mud, not when it had looked at her the way it had, as though she were the only safe thing left in the world. She carried it into the old hay barn at the far end of the property, a place rarely visited by the family or the other staff. She found a corner where broken tools were kept and made a small nest out of straw and an old sack. She examined the puppy's leg gently. It was not broken cleanly, but it was swollen and clearly painful. She had seen the stable hands set injured limbs on horses before. She did her best to remember what she had watched, wrapping the leg carefully with a strip of cloth torn from her own petticoat. "There," she said softly, stroking its head. "You will be all right, I promise." The puppy licked weakly at her fingers, and for a moment, in that cold and drafty barn, Elsie felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt needed. She felt that her hands, which spent most days scrubbing floors and hauling water, could also do something gentle and good. She did not know how long she stayed there, but the light outside had begun to dim by the time she remembered her duties. She had left the feed bucket in the yard. She had likely already been missed. She hurried back across the muddy yard, her heart pounding, rehearsing an excuse in her mind. But when she reached the kitchen door, she found it was worse than she feared. Julian Merrick, the young master of the house, was standing near the stables with two of the hunting dogs at his heels, his boots clean despite the rain, his expression already twisted into something unpleasant. "Where have you been?" he demanded. "I was securing the feed, sir," Elsie said, keeping her eyes low. The rain made the ground slippery. Julian studied her for a long moment, the way a cat studies something it intends to torment. He had never liked her, not since she had once refused to laugh at a servant girl he mocked for stuttering. He considered obedience the only virtue a servant needed, and Elsie's quiet defiance, small as it was, had never sat well with him. "You smell like the barn," he said. "I was near the stables, sir." "Show me your hands." Elsie hesitated only a moment before holding them out. There was straw caught in her sleeve, and a faint smear of blood from the puppy's leg on her fingers. Julian's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" "I cut myself on a nail, sir. It is nothing." He did not believe her. He never believed her. Not because he was clever, but because he enjoyed disbelieving people beneath him. He walked past her toward the barn, and Elsie's stomach dropped. "Sir, please, there is no need." But he was already moving, and she had no choice but to follow, her mind racing for some way to protect the small creature she had hidden. When they reached the barn, Julian pushed open the door and looked around until his eyes landed on the corner where the puppy lay curled in its makeshift bed. "A dog," he said, his voice flat with disgust. "You risked your duties for a mongrel." "He was hurt," Elsie said quickly. "He would have died in the rain." "And what business is that of yours?" "I could not leave him." Julian crouched down, and for a moment Elsie thought perhaps he might show some flicker of mercy. Instead, He reached for the puppy roughly, lifting it by the scruff despite its whimper of pain. He walked toward the water trough near the barn entrance, and Elsie understood with sudden horror what he intended to do. "No," she said, stepping forward. "Please, sir, don't. It is a stray, vermin. It does not belong on this property. He has done nothing wrong. Please, I will keep him hidden. He will not trouble anyone." Julian ignored her, holding the puppy over the water. Elsie did not think. She simply moved, placing herself between him and the trough, her hands closing around the puppy and pulling it from his grip before he could stop her. The puppy yelped, and Julian stumbled back, startled and then furious. "You dare put your hands on me." "I did not mean to," Elsie said quickly, cradling the shaking puppy against her chest. "I only meant to save him. You forget your place." "I am sorry, sir. Truly. Please, just let him live. I will make sure you never see him again." For a moment Julian said nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes cold. Then he turned and walked out of the barn without another word, and Elsie allowed herself to breathe, thinking perhaps the matter was over. She was wrong. Within the hour, she was summoned to the main house. Lady Constance Merrick stood in the drawing room, her expression as sharp and cold as the rain outside. Julian stood beside her, arms crossed, a faint and satisfied look on his face. "My son tells me you struck him," Lady Constance said. "I did not strike him, my lady. I only stopped him from harming an animal." "You laid hands on him." "I only meant to protect the puppy, my lady. I did not intend disrespect." "Intention does not matter in this house," Lady Constance said. "Obedience does. You have been given shelter and wages that others would be grateful for, and you repay that kindness by defying my son in front of the staff." Elsie wanted to argue, wanted to explain that no one had witnessed the moment except Julian himself, that there was no audience to embarrass, only a small creature that would have drowned. But she had learned long ago that arguing only made things worse in this house. "I am sorry, my lady," she said instead, her voice trembling. "Sorry is not enough." Elsie looked past Lady Constance for a moment, toward the tall windows where rain streaked down the glass in long silver lines. She thought of all the other times she had stood in this room, head bowed, absorbing words meant to remind her of her place. She had always told herself that endurance was its own kind of strength, that a servant who bent did not break. Tonight, for the first time, she wondered if bending only made the next blow easier to land. "Take her below," Lady Constance said to the housekeeper, Mrs. Bramwell, who stood near the doorway with her hands folded and her eyes carefully averted. "See that she understands the seriousness of tonight's disobedience." Mrs. Bramwell hesitated only a moment before stepping forward, her expression unreadable, though something flickered briefly in her eyes that might have been sympathy, quickly hidden away. What followed was something Elsie would try, in the days after, not to remember too clearly. She was taken to the servants' quarters and made an example of, in the way Lady Constance believed necessary to maintain order. When it was over, she lay curled on her narrow cot in the dark, her body aching, her breath uneven, but her arms still curled protectively around the small bundle she had refused to let go of even then. The puppy pressed its nose against her hand and let out a small, comforting sound, as if it understood, in its own simple way, what she had given up to keep it safe. She stroked its ears with careful fingers, ignoring the ache that ran through her own body, and thought of all the years she had spent in this house learning to disappear, to want nothing, to expect nothing. She had never once fought back, not until tonight, and though her body paid the price for it, some small, stubborn part of her did not regret it. "We will be all right," Elsie whispered into the darkness. Though she was not certain she believed it, somehow, "we will be all right." She thought of her mother, long gone now, who used to say that kindness was never wasted, even when it seemed to cost more than it gave back. Elsie had held on to those words through years of hard labor and harder treatment, and tonight, for the first time in a long while, she let herself believe them again. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, whether Julian would find some new way to punish her, or whether Lady Constance would decide the puppy was still a problem to be dealt with. But for tonight, the small creature was warm, and breathing, and alive, curled safely against her side. Outside, the storm continued through the night, rain hammering against the thin roof of the servants' quarters. But inside, in the dark, a small act of kindness had taken root, one that neither Elsie nor anyone else in the house yet understood would soon change everything. Because far beyond the estate gates, a carriage bearing the crest of the Duke of Halloway was already making its way down the rain-soaked road, drawing steadily closer with each passing mile. The carriage rolled through the gates of Merrick Estate just as the storm began to ease into a fine, cold drizzle. Duke Edmund Halloway stepped down from it without waiting for the footman to fully lower the step, his boots landing firm on the wet gravel. He had traveled 2 days for this visit, a matter concerning a boundary dispute over land his family had once shared with the Merricks, and he intended to settle it quickly and return home. He had little patience left for long visits and longer conversations with people he did not particularly respect. Lady Constance Merrick greeted him at the entrance with practiced warmth, her smile polished and her words smoother still. "Your Grace, what an honor. We were not expecting you until tomorrow." "I made good time," Edmund said simply, handing his coat to a waiting servant. "I would prefer to settle the matter of the eastern boundary swiftly, if it is convenient." Of course, though surely you will stay the week. My son would be glad of the company, and there is so little society out here in the country." Edmund gave a polite but non-committal answer, already surveying the entrance hall with the quiet, assessing gaze of a man used to reading rooms and the people within them. He was not a man given to idle curiosity, but something about the house unsettled him in a way he could not immediately name. The servants moved with a stiffness that seemed to go beyond simple discipline. Their eyes stayed low. Their voices, when they spoke at all, were careful and quiet, as though even the wrong tone might bring consequence. He said nothing of it that first evening. He dined with Lady Constance and her son Julian, listening to Julian's boasting about hunting and horses with only half his attention, while the other half remained fixed on the household around him. He noticed the way a young footman flinched when a serving dish was set down too loudly near him. He noticed the way Lady Constance's eyes tracked every servant's movement, as though searching for the smallest excuse to find fault. It was the following morning, while walking the estate gardens to clear his head before the day's business discussions, that he first saw Elsie. She was carrying linens across the courtyard, her steps careful, her movements slightly stiff in a way that caught his attention immediately. He had trained himself, through years of managing his own household and estates, to notice small signs of distress in the people around him, whether that distress came from illness, exhaustion, or something else entirely. Something about the way she held her shoulders, the careful economy of her movements, told him this was not simple fatigue. "You there," he called, not unkindly. Elsie startled, nearly dropping the linens in her arms, before turning to face him with a quick, practiced curtsy. "Your Grace, I did not see you. Are you injured?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. Her eyes widened slightly before she composed herself, her expression falling back into careful neutrality. "No, Your Grace, I am quite well." "You move as though you are in pain." "I slipped in the rain yesterday, Your Grace. It is nothing serious." He studied her for a long moment. Up close, he could see faint shadows beneath her eyes, the kind that came not from a single bad night, but from a life lived under constant strain. There was a small bruise visible at the edge of her sleeve where the fabric had shifted, and she noticed him notice it, quickly adjusting the cloth to cover it again. "What is your name?" "Elsie, Your Grace, Elsie Cartwright." "And how long have you served this household, Elsie Cartwright?" "Nearly 6 years, Your Grace." He nodded slowly, filing the information away the way he filed away every useful detail, out of habit more than immediate purpose. "Carry on, then. I did not mean to delay you." "Thank you, Your Grace." She hurried away, and Edmund remained standing in the garden a moment longer, turning the brief exchange over in his mind. He was not a man prone to hasty conclusions, but something about the encounter lingered with him through the rest of the morning, distracting him, even as Julian led him toward the stables to discuss the boundary maps. Julian, for his part, seemed entirely unaware of Edmund's growing unease, chattering on about hunting dogs and horses with the easy confidence of a young man who had never once questioned his own place in the world. Edmund answered when necessary, but his attention kept drifting back to the servants moving quietly through the estate grounds, each one seeming to shrink slightly whenever Julian or his mother passed nearby. At midday, Edmund took his meal alone in the small study set aside for his use, having declined Lady Constance's invitation to dine with the family again so soon. He preferred, in unfamiliar houses, to observe more than he participated, and something told him that observation would serve him well here. Through the study window, he watched the courtyard below, where servants moved back and forth on their various errands. He noticed how they organized themselves almost unconsciously to avoid crossing paths with Julian when he strode through the yard toward the stables. He noticed how a young footman nearly dropped a tray of silver when Lady Constance's voice carried sharply from an upstairs window, scolding someone for a fault Edmund could not make out. He thought of his own household, of the steward and housekeeper who ran it with firm but fair hands, of servants who greeted him with genuine warmth rather than practiced fear. He had never considered himself a particularly soft man, but he believed firmly that a household built on terror was a household poorly built, regardless of how smoothly its surface appeared to run. What he observed here troubled him more with each passing hour. It was later that afternoon, while reviewing old land documents in the estate's library, that Edmund overheard a conversation through a partially open door. Two maids were speaking in low voices, believing themselves unobserved. "She could barely stand this morning," one of them whispered. "I do not know how she managed her duties at all. She never complains, though, not once, even after last night." "What happened last night?" "Do you not know? She hid an injured dog in the barn. Master Julian found it and meant to drown it in the trough. She stopped him." "She put her hands on him?" "Only to save the poor creature. But you know how the mistress is. She was taken below for it." Edmund's grip tightened slightly on the papers in his hands, though his expression remained carefully still. He set the documents down and rose from his chair, moving quietly toward the door, careful not to announce his presence too abruptly. The maids, upon noticing him, fell instantly silent, their faces draining of color. "Your Grace," one of them said, dropping into a hurried curtsy. "We did not mean. We were only—" "You need not explain yourselves to me," Edmund said, his voice calm but carrying an edge neither maid missed. "I am simply passing through." He left them there, his mind now turning over everything he had witnessed since his arrival with a new and troubling clarity. The stiffness in the servants' movements, the bruise on Elsie's wrist, the careful, controlled fear that seemed to hang over the entire household like a fog that never quite lifted. He found himself, that evening, watching Lady Constance more closely across the dinner table, noting the practiced ease with which she spoke of order and discipline, the way she referred to her servants as though they were tools to be maintained rather than people to be treated with basic decency. "You run a tight household, Lady Constance," he said carefully, testing the waters. "One must, Your Grace, particularly out here, where good help is difficult to find, and easier still to lose to laziness. Discipline keeps a household functioning properly. I am sure you understand this as well as any man of your standing." "Discipline, yes," Edmund said, "though I confess I have always found that a household runs best when its people are not afraid to look their master in the eye." Lady Constance's smile flickered, just barely, before settling back into place. "A pleasant sentiment, Your Grace, though perhaps one easier held by those who have never had to manage a large staff." Julian, who had been mostly quiet through this exchange, leaned back in his chair with the easy arrogance of a man who had never once been made to answer for his own conduct. "Servants forget themselves easily enough if you let them, Your Grace. A firm hand now and then reminds them of their purpose. Surely you keep order in your own house the same way." "I keep order," Edmund said evenly, "by ensuring my people are treated fairly and paid honestly for their labor. I have found that loyalty earned this way is worth far more than obedience purchased through fear." Julian's smile faltered slightly, though he covered it quickly with a short laugh. "A noble sentiment, Your Grace, though I wonder how well it would hold up if your servants ever tested it." "They have," Edmund said simply, and it held. The table fell quiet for a moment, the clink of silverware against china the only sound, before Lady Constance smoothly redirected the conversation toward the following day's discussion of the boundary lines, eager to steer away from a topic that had grown uncomfortably pointed. Edmund allowed the conversation to shift, but he noted, with quiet interest, the way Julian's jaw remained tight for the rest of the meal, as though something in the exchange had unsettled him more than he wished to admit. Edmund said nothing further on the matter that evening, but he did not forget Lady Constance's words, nor the flicker of unease that had crossed her face when he spoke them, nor the defensive edge in Julian's voice. He excused himself early, claiming fatigue from his journey, though in truth he wanted time alone to think. Later that night, unable to sleep, he walked the grounds beneath a clearing sky. The storm finally passed, leaving the air clean and cold. His path led him, whether by accident or some quiet instinct, toward the old barn at the edge of the property. He pushed open the door and found, in the dim light of a single lantern left burning low, Elsie curled on a bed of straw beside a small, sleeping puppy, its leg wrapped carefully in cloth. She startled awake at the sound of the door, scrambling upright, her eyes wide with alarm at being discovered. "Your Grace, I did not mean— Please, I can explain." "You do not need to explain," Edmund said quietly, stepping further into the barn, his eyes moving from her face to the small, sleeping animal beside her. "I already know most of it." Elsie's breath caught, uncertainty and fear warring plainly across her features. She had learned, over years of hard service, that kindness from those above her station was rare and often came with a price she could not always afford to pay. She did not yet know what kind of man stood before her, whether he was one who might help her, or simply one more person with the power to make her life harder than it already was. Edmund crouched slowly beside the puppy, careful not to startle it, and examined the makeshift bandage on its leg with something close to approval. "You did this yourself?" "Yes, Your Grace." I have watched the stable hands set injuries before. I did what I could. It is well done, he said, and something in his voice, quiet and sincere, eased a small measure of the tension in her shoulders. You saved this creature's life. I only did what anyone would do. No, Edmund said, looking up at her directly now, his gaze steady and searching. I do not believe that is true at all. The silence between them stretched, filled with things neither of them said aloud yet, questions and answers that would come later, in the days ahead. Elsie studied him carefully in the low lantern light, trying to read what lay beneath his calm exterior. She had met noblemen before, guests of the house who spoke kindly enough at dinner but thought nothing of the servants who filled their glasses and cleared their plates. This man seemed different, though she could not yet say how, or whether she dared trust that difference. Something had shifted in that quiet barn, beneath the dim lantern light, something neither of them could yet name, but both of them, in their own way, already sensed. The puppy stirred in its sleep, letting out a small sound before settling again, and Edmund's gaze softened briefly as he looked at it. What will you call him? The question surprised her, simple and unexpected amid everything else. I had not thought of a name, Your Grace. I did not want to grow too attached, in case he could not be kept. Every creature deserves a name, Edmund said, even one that has only just begun its life again. Elsie looked down at the small, sleeping animal, its fur beginning to dry and fluff in the warmth of the barn, its injured leg wrapped snugly beneath the blanket she had found for it. Copper, she said finally, for the color of his fur, in the right light. Copper, Edmund repeated, something almost like a smile touching the corner of his mouth. A fine name. He rose to his feet, brushing straw from his coat, his expression once again composed and unreadable, though his mind was far from settled. Rest well, Elsie Cartwright, he said. I do not think this matter is finished. He left her there with those words hanging in the cold night air, and long after he had gone, Elsie remained awake, staring at the closed barn door, wondering what exactly the Duke of Holloway intended to do next. Morning came gray and quiet over Merrick Estate, but Edmund had already been awake for hours by the time the household began to stir. He had spent much of the night turning over what he had learned, piecing together fragments of overheard conversation and careful observation into something that felt less like suspicion and more like certainty. He was a man who dealt in facts, in ledgers and evidence, and he did not intend to act on instinct alone. Before he confronted anyone, he wanted the full truth, gathered carefully and without doubt. He began, quietly, with the servants themselves. His first conversation was with an older groundskeeper named Peter, a man who had worked the estate for nearly 20 years, and carried himself with the weary caution of someone who had long since learned to expect little kindness from those above him. Edmund found him near the stables, mending a length of fence, and approached with the easy, unhurried manner of a man simply passing time. Fine work, Edmund said, nodding toward the fence. Thank you, Your Grace. Peter did not look up from his task, his hands steady despite the visible tension in his shoulders. You have been here a long while, I understand. Nearly 20 years, Your Grace. You must have seen a great deal change in that time. Peter's hands paused briefly on the fence post before resuming their work. Some things change, Your Grace, others do not. And which category, Edmund asked carefully, would you say the treatment of the staff falls into? The older man finally looked up, studying Edmund with a wariness that suggested he had learned, through hard experience, not to trust easily. Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but why do you ask? Because I have eyes, Edmund said simply, and I do not like what they have shown me since my arrival. Peter was quiet for a long moment, glancing around the empty yard as though checking for unseen listeners before he spoke again, his voice lowered. It was not always this way, Your Grace. Lady Constance's late husband ran this house with a fair hand. Since he passed, and since young Master Julian grew into his own ways, things have grown harder for those of us who serve here. Complaints are not welcomed. Those who speak up do not stay long, or they stay and suffer for it. And the girl, Elsie Cartwright, what can you tell me of her? Peter's expression softened slightly. A good girl, Your Grace. Hard-working, kind, even when kindness is not returned to her. She has taken the worst of it these past years, I think, on account of her stubbornness. She will not simply nod along the way the rest of us have learned to. It has cost her dearly. Would you be willing to speak of this again, if it became necessary? Formally, I mean. Peter's eyes widened slightly at the implication behind the question, but after a moment he nodded slowly. If it meant an end to how things are done here, Your Grace, yes, I would speak. Edmund thanked him and moved on, continuing his quiet investigation throughout the morning. He spoke next with a young maid named Nora, who he found polishing silver alone in the pantry, her hands moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone used to long hours of repetitive labor. When he gently asked whether she might speak with him privately for a few moments, she looked up with visible alarm, glancing toward the door as though expecting someone to appear and forbid the conversation entirely. "Have I done something wrong, Your Grace?" "Not at all," Edmund assured her. "I only wish to ask you a few questions, and I promise you will not be punished for anything you say to me." Nora's hands trembled slightly as she set down the silver she had been polishing, and it took several minutes of patient, gentle questioning before she began to speak freely. Once she did, the words came quickly, as though a dam long held back had finally broken. She described nights spent working past exhaustion without complaint, afraid of what might happen if she asked for rest. She described witnessing Elsie punished on more than one occasion for offenses no greater than a dropped dish or a delayed errand. She wept openly as she spoke, wiping her eyes hurriedly with the back of her hand, embarrassed by her own emotion but unable to stop the words once they had begun. "She has always been kind to the rest of us, Your Grace, even when kindness cost her dearly. I do not understand how anyone could treat her so cruelly and feel no shame for it." Edmund listened to every word without interruption, his expression calm on the surface, though something colder and more determined settled steadily within him with each new detail she shared. By the time Nora finished, wiping the last of her tears away and apologizing unnecessarily for her outburst, Edmund's resolve had hardened into something unshakable. He spoke with the steward, Mr. Griggs, a cautious man who chose his words carefully, but confirmed, in careful and measured tones, that household funds meant for staff wages had been quietly reduced over the past 2 years, while Lady Constance's own personal expenditures had grown. Later that morning, Mr. Griggs found Edmund alone in the library and, after glancing carefully toward the door to ensure they were not overheard, produced a small ledger from beneath his coat. "I should not be showing you this, Your Grace," the steward said quietly, "but I find I can no longer keep silent about what I have watched happen in this house." Edmund took the ledger and studied the careful columns of figures within, his brow furrowing as he traced the pattern Griggs had marked with small, discreet notations in the margins. "These wages have been reduced steadily over 2 years. Yes, Your Grace, while Lady Constance's own accounts, listed separately in the household books, have grown considerably in the same period. New gowns, new carriages, improvements to her private apartments. All while the staff below stairs have gone without proper wages, and in some cases, without adequate food. Why have you not reported this before now? Surely there are magistrates, authorities who oversee such matters." Griggs's expression grew weary. "Lady Constance is well connected, Your Grace, and I am but a steward with no family name to protect me if I speak against her, and am proven wrong, or if she simply decides to ruin me for the attempt. I have a wife and children to think of. I am ashamed to say fear has kept me silent longer than my conscience should have allowed." "You are not the only one," Edmund said quietly, thinking of Peter, of Nora, of every servant in this house who had weighed the same impossible choice between conscience and survival. "But that changes now. I will need to borrow this ledger, if you can spare it discreetly." "Take it, Your Grace. I copied the relevant figures into my own private notes, should the original ever go missing before it is needed." Edmund thanked him, tucking the ledger carefully away, another solid piece of evidence added to the case slowly forming in his mind. He spent the remainder of the morning reviewing the figures in detail, cross-referencing dates and amounts, building a clear and damning picture of financial neglect that ran alongside the pattern of physical mistreatment he had already begun to uncover. Each conversation, each fragment of evidence, added another piece to a picture that grew darker and more troubling with every detail. By midday, Edmund had gathered enough testimony to understand that what he had witnessed in Elsie was not an isolated incident, but a pattern woven into the very fabric of how the estate was run. He found himself, in a quiet moment between conversations, standing near the barn once more, watching from a distance as Elsie carried water to Copper, checking his bandaged leg with careful, practiced hands, despite the visible stiffness in her own movements. She did not know she was observed, and there was something in her unguarded expression, a tenderness she likely rarely allowed herself to show openly, that struck him more deeply than he expected. He approached slowly, and she startled slightly upon noticing him, straightening quickly despite the discomfort it clearly cost her. "Your Grace, I did not expect you." "I did not mean to intrude," Edmund said. "How is he healing?" Elsie glanced down at the puppy, who was attempting with limited success to hobble toward a patch of sunlight near the barn door. "Slowly, Your Grace, but he is healing. He has more spirit than his injury would suggest. Much like his rescuer, I think." Elsie's cheeks colored slightly at the comment, and she looked down, unsure how to respond to praise so plainly given. She was not accustomed to it, and something about the directness of his words unsettled her in a way she could not fully explain. "Your Grace, may I ask you something?" "Of course. Why does this matter to you?" "You are a guest here, concerned with land and boundaries. The affairs of this household staff are not your responsibility." Edmund considered the question carefully before answering, choosing his words with the same deliberate care he applied to matters of far greater consequence. "I have spent my life believing that a man's character is measured not by how he treats those who can benefit him, but by how he treats those who cannot. What I have witnessed in this house, in the short time I have been here, troubles me deeply. I do not believe I could leave with a clear conscience, knowing what I now know, without doing something to address it." "And what do you intend to do?" "I intend," Edmund said, "to request a private audience with you. This evening, if you are willing. I want to hear, in full, and in your own words, everything that has happened to you in this house. Not fragments overheard through doorways, not second-hand accounts from other servants, however well-meaning. I want the truth from you directly, so that when I act with certainty." Elsie hesitated, old instincts warring within her. She had learned, painfully, that speaking honestly in this house carried consequences. Even now, with a duke standing before her offering what sounded like genuine concern, some part of her feared this might yet prove to be another trap, another test she could fail. "If Lady Constance learns of this, she will not learn of it from me," Edmund said firmly, "and I will ensure, whatever comes of this conversation, that you are protected from any retaliation. You have my word." Elsie studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of insincerity, any flicker of the practiced charm she had seen in other guests who made promises they never intended to keep. She found none. His expression was steady, serious, entirely without the condescension she had come to expect from those of his station. "All right," she said finally, quietly. "I will speak with you." "Thank you," Edmund said, and something in his tone suggested he understood, at least in part, what the decision had cost her to make. "This evening, then, after the household has settled for the night, I will send word of where and when." He left her there with Copper, and Elsie remained in the barn for a long while after he had gone, her hand still shaking slightly, though whether from fear or something closer to hope, she could not entirely say. The rest of the day passed slowly, each hour stretching longer than the last, as Elsie moved through her duties with a mind too occupied to fully focus on the tasks before her. She scrubbed floors and folded linens and carried water, all while turning over Edmund's words again and again, wondering what exactly she would say to him that evening, and more urgently, wondering what it might cost her if Lady Constance ever discovered the conversation had taken place at all. Julian, unaware of the quiet investigation unfolding around him, spent much of the afternoon complaining loudly to his mother about the Duke's apparent interest in matters that did not concern him. "He asked me directly, at dinner, whether I test my own household's loyalty," Julian said, pacing the length of the drawing room, while Lady Constance sat calmly with her needlework, seemingly unbothered by her son's agitation. "What business is it of his, how we manage our staff? The Duke is a guest, Julian, and a powerful one. It would be foolish to provoke him needlessly over matters of household discipline. Simply be civil until his business here is concluded, and he will return to his own affairs soon enough. He has been asking questions among the servants. I saw him speaking with old Peter this morning, and again with that wretched girl near the barn." Lady Constance's needle paused briefly in its work, though her expression remained composed. "What sort of questions? I do not know precisely, but I do not like it, Mother. He looks at us as though we have done something wrong. Then we shall simply ensure he finds nothing to confirm whatever suspicions he has formed," Lady Constance said smoothly, though a careful observer might have noticed the slight tightening around her eyes, the first small crack in her otherwise perfectly composed exterior. "In the meantime, I suggest you keep your temper in check around him. We cannot afford to give him further cause for concern, whatever his interest in this household might actually be." Julian said nothing further, but his expression remained sour for the rest of the afternoon, and he made a point, later that evening, of watching the household staff more closely than usual, searching for any sign of what conversations might be taking place beyond his notice. He found Griggs in the corridor near the study and stopped him with a sharp hand against the wall, blocking his path. "You have been spending a great deal of time with our guest, Griggs. The Duke had questions regarding the Eastern Boundary record, sir. Nothing more. See that it stays nothing more. I do not like the way he looks at this family, as though he has already decided we are guilty of some crime. I could not say what the Duke thinks, sir. I only manage the accounts as I am instructed." Julian studied him a moment longer, suspicion evident in his narrowed eyes. before finally stepping aside and allowing the steward to pass. Griggs walked on without hurrying his pace, though his heart pounded uncomfortably in his chest, keenly aware of how much now rested on the ledger already safely delivered into the Duke's keeping. As night fell over the estate, Elsie made her way quietly toward the small study Edmund had indicated in his message, her heart pounding with each careful step through the darkened corridors. She had waited until she was certain the rest of the household had retired for the evening, moving through the halls with the practiced silence of someone accustomed to remaining unseen. She found Edmund waiting for her, a single candle burning on the desk before him, the room otherwise dark and quiet. He rose when she entered, gesturing toward a chair across from his own with a gentleness that eased, if only slightly, the tension coiled tight in her chest. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I know this was not an easy decision for you to make." "No," Elsie admitted, sitting carefully, still mindful of the soreness in her body from the previous night. "It was not. You need not tell me everything tonight, if it proves too difficult. But whatever you are willing to share, I will listen carefully, and I promise you, nothing you say here will leave this room without your consent." Elsie looked at him for a long moment in the flickering candlelight, weighing years of silence and fear against the small, fragile possibility that someone with real power might finally be willing to listen. She thought of Copper, healing slowly in the barn, of Peter's careful testimony, of Nora's tears, of every servant in this house who had learned to make themselves smaller and quieter with each passing year. "Where would you like me to begin?" she asked softly. "Wherever feels right to you," Edmund said. "I am not going anywhere." And so, in the quiet, candlelit study, with the rest of the house asleep around them, Elsie began, haltingly at first, and then with growing steadiness, to tell him everything. The candle between them burned low as Elsie spoke, her voice unsteady at first, then growing gradually stronger as the words she had held back for years finally found their way into the open air. Edmund sat quietly across from her, his hands folded on the desk, listening with a stillness that never once wavered, even as the details she shared grew increasingly difficult to hear. She told him of her arrival at the estate as a girl of 13, orphaned and with nowhere else to turn, grateful at first for the shelter and work Lady Constance's late husband had offered her. She spoke of how things had begun to change after his death, slowly at first, small cruelties that seemed almost accidental, and then more deliberately, as Julian grew older, and Lady Constance's patience for anything resembling independent thought among her staff wore thinner with each passing year. "It was never one single thing," Elsie explained, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "It was many small things, over a long time. A meal withheld for a mistake, extra duties added as punishment for speaking out of turn. And when those did not seem to teach the lesson quickly enough, it became something more direct." "How often?" Edmund asked quietly. "Often enough that I stopped counting, Your Grace. Often enough that I learned to expect it, the way one learns to expect rain in autumn." She told him of the previous night, of finding Copper injured in the rain, of Julian's intention to drown the small creature, of the choice she made to intervene despite knowing the likely cost. She spoke of it plainly, without exaggeration or self-pity, simply laying out the facts as they had happened, though Edmund could see the effort it cost her to keep her voice steady throughout. "And Lady Constance ordered the punishment herself?" "Yes, Your Grace. She does not often carry it out with her own hands. She prefers to instruct others, and to watch." Something dark passed briefly across Edmund's expression at this detail, though he said nothing, allowing Elsie to continue at her own pace. She told him of other servants who had suffered similarly over the years, some who had left the estate entirely rather than endure it further, though leaving without reference or savings often meant trading one hardship for another, uncertain and equally dangerous. "Why has no one reported this before now?" Edmund asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Who would believe a servant's word against a lady's, Your Grace? And even if believed, what protection would exist for any of us afterward? Lady Constance has connections throughout the county. Speaking against her risks not only one's position here, but any hope of employment elsewhere, should word spread that we caused trouble for our betters. Edmund absorbed this in silence for a long moment, the weight of the systemic nature of the cruelty settling over him fully for the first time. This was not simply a matter of one cruel household, easily corrected through a single conversation or a stern warning. It was a structure built carefully over years, reinforced by fear and isolation, designed specifically to ensure silence. "I intend to change that," he said finally. "Your Grace, I do not wish to see you place yourself at odds with Lady Constance on my account. She is not without influence, and I would not have you suffer any consequence for kindness shown to someone in my position. Elsie." He said her name gently but firmly, drawing her attention fully to him. "What has been done to you, and to others in this household, is not a small matter that can be quietly overlooked for the sake of comfortable relations between neighboring estates. I hold considerable influence in matters concerning this county, influence that Lady Constance herself depends upon in ways she may not fully realize. I intend to use that influence to ensure this ends, permanently, and that those responsible answer for what they have done. What influence do you mean, Your Grace? Edmund considered how much to explain, weighing the wisdom of revealing his full position before he was ready to act. There are financial matters tied to this estate that Lady Constance is not yet aware I have knowledge of. Debts owed, obligations connected to my own family's holdings in this county, arrangements that give me more leverage over her circumstances than she currently understands. I have spent the day gathering evidence, speaking with your fellow servants, reviewing the household's financial records. What I have found paints a picture that, combined with your testimony tonight, leaves little room for denial. Elsie stared at him, trying to process the magnitude of what he was describing. You have been planning this since yesterday? Since the moment I saw the bruise on your wrist and recognized it for what it was, Edmund said. I do not make a habit of interfering in the affairs of other households, but I could not, in good conscience, witness what I witnessed here, and simply return home as though nothing were wrong. And what will happen to Lady Constance, to Julian? That depends on many factors, some of which I cannot yet predict with certainty, but I intend to see them held accountable, in whatever manner proves most effective. I would prefer this handled through proper channels, quietly if possible, but I will not hesitate to make the matter public if that proves necessary to ensure real change occurs. Elsie sat with this for a long moment, the candle flickering low between them, casting long shadows across the small study. Years of learned caution warred within her against the cautious hope beginning to take root, a feeling she barely recognized after so long spent expecting disappointment from anyone with power over her circumstances. Why does this matter so much to you, Your Grace? Truly, you gain nothing from involving yourself in this. Edmund considered the question seriously before answering. My own mother served briefly as a governess before marrying my father, in circumstances not entirely different from those many servants face. She often told me that character reveals itself most clearly in how a person treats those who have no power to reward or punish them in return. I have tried to live by that lesson throughout my life. What I witnessed here, from the moment of my arrival, offended every principle I hold. I could not simply look away. The sincerity in his voice left little room for doubt, and something in Elsie's chest loosened slightly. A tension she had carried for so long she had nearly forgotten what its absence might feel like. There is one more matter I must ask of you, Edmund continued. I intend to gather formal testimony from you, and from the other servants willing to speak. Testimony I can present clearly and undeniably when the time comes to confront Lady Constance directly. This will not be easy, and I will understand entirely if you are not prepared to have your account made known so openly. Elsie was quiet for a long moment, considering the weight of what he was asking. She thought of Peter, who had already agreed to speak. She thought of Nora, whose tears Edmund had gently described to her. She thought of every servant in this house who had learned, through hard experience, that silence was the only safe choice available to them. I will speak, she said finally, her voice steady despite the fear still coiled tightly within her. If it means an end to this, for myself and for everyone else who has suffered here, I will speak plainly and without hesitation. Thank you, Edmund said, and the quiet gratitude in his voice carried more weight than any grand declaration could have managed. I do not take this decision lightly, nor the courage it requires of you. They spoke for a while longer, Edmund carefully recording details of her account in a small notebook he had brought for the purpose, ensuring nothing would be lost or forgotten by the time it mattered most. When at last the conversation drew to its natural close, the candle had burned nearly to its base, and the household around them remained blessedly undisturbed by their long exchange. You should return to your quarters before you are missed, Edmund said finally, rising from his chair. Rest, if you are able. Tomorrow, I intend to begin the final preparations for what comes next. And Copper? Copper, Edmund said, and something almost like warmth touched his otherwise serious expression, will remain safely in your care, whatever else occurs in the coming days. That much I can promise you without any uncertainty at all. Elsie rose as well, offering a small, uncertain smile, the first genuine one Edmund had seen from her since his arrival. Thank you, Your Grace, for listening, for believing me, without needing more proof than my own words. Your words were proof enough, Edmund said simply. Good night, Elsie Cartwright. Sleep well if you can. She slipped quietly from the study, making her way back through the darkened corridors toward the servants' quarters, her mind full of everything that had passed between them. For the first time in longer than she could remember, She allowed herself to imagine a future different from the one she had long resigned herself to. One where fear did not govern every choice she made, where kindness was not punished but recognized for what it truly was. Behind her, alone in the study, Edmund extinguished the last of the candle and sat for a long while in the darkness, turning over everything he had learned, everything still left to accomplish before this matter reached its necessary conclusion. He thought of the ledger hidden safely among his belongings, of the testimonies gathered throughout the day, of Elsie's quiet courage in finally speaking her full truth aloud. Tomorrow, he would begin assembling everything into a case too solid to deny, too thoroughly documented to dismiss. The next morning, Elsie rose before dawn as always, her body still aching but her mind lighter than it had been in years. She moved through her early duties with unusual care, aware that any misstep now might draw unwanted attention at the worst possible moment. She had nearly finished carrying the morning's water when Julian appeared in the corridor, blocking her path with the casual entitlement of someone accustomed to occupying whatever space he chose. "You look remarkably well rested," he said, studying her with narrowed eyes. "For someone who was punished so thoroughly 2 nights past." "I am simply attending to my duties, sir. I saw the Duke leaving the barn rather late last night. Strange hour for a nobleman to be wandering the grounds." Elsie kept her expression carefully neutral, though her heart quickened uncomfortably. "I would not know his movements, sir. I was asleep." "Were you?" Julian's tone made clear he did not believe her, though he had no proof to offer against the claim. "See that you remember your place, girl, regardless of whatever attention a passing guest chooses to show you. He will return to his own estate soon enough, and you will remain here, answerable to my mother and to me, as you have always been." "Yes, sir," Elsie said quietly, lowering her eyes in the practiced manner she had perfected over years of similar exchanges, though inwardly something had shifted that Julian could not see, a quiet resolve that no longer bent quite so easily beneath his words. He studied her a moment longer, clearly searching for some crack in her composure, before finally stepping aside and allowing her to pass. Elsie continued on, her hands trembling only slightly around the water pail, grateful that years of practice had taught her how to mask fear behind a calm exterior, even when her pulse raced beneath it. Edmund, meanwhile, spent the morning finalizing the evidence he had gathered, cross-referencing Elsie's account against the testimonies already collected from Peter, Nora, and Griggs, ensuring every detail aligned into a single, undeniable narrative. He reviewed the ledger once more, calculating the full extent of wages withheld over the past 2 years, a sum considerable enough to constitute far more than simple household mismanagement. He met briefly with Griggs again that morning, the steward slipping into the library under the pretense of delivering correspondence. "2 more of the staff have come forward since yesterday, Your Grace," Griggs said quietly, glancing toward the door out of habit. "Word has spread quietly among those who can be trusted. They wish to add their accounts to what you are gathering, if you are willing to hear them." "I am more than willing," Edmund said. "The more complete this account, the less room remains for denial when the time comes." "May I ask, Your Grace, when you intend that time to be?" Edmund considered the question carefully. "Soon. I would prefer to act while the evidence remains fresh, and the household's attention has not yet grown suspicious enough to interfere. Perhaps tomorrow, if all remaining testimonies can be gathered by then." Griggs nodded, some of the tension easing visibly from his shoulders at the confirmation that this matter, so long endured in silence, was finally approaching its resolution. "I will see that everything is arranged, Your Grace, as discreetly as possible." The household slept on that night, unaware of the reckoning that had already begun quietly taking shape within its walls, unaware that the visiting Duke they had welcomed with practiced smiles and careful words had already seen through every carefully maintained illusion, and intended, before he left this place, to bring it all crumbling down. By the following afternoon, Edmund had gathered everything he needed. 6 servants had come forward in total, each offering testimony that corroborated the others in painful, consistent detail. The ledger sat carefully documented alongside his own notes, every figure cross-referenced and verified. He had spent the morning arranging matters with quiet precision, ensuring that when the moment came, there would be no room for denial, no path of escape through clever words or wounded protests of innocence. Before making his request, Edmund took a final precaution, meeting privately with Peter to ensure the older groundskeeper understood exactly what might unfold that evening, and remained willing to stand by his testimony if directly challenged. "Once this begins," Edmund said, "there will be no quiet retreat. Lady Constance will not take this lightly, and I need to know each of you remains prepared to speak the truth aloud, even if she attempts to shame or intimidate you into silence." "We have endured worse than her temper, Your Grace," Peter said grimly. "We will not falter now, not after coming this far." Word of the coming reckoning had begun to spread quietly among the trusted staff throughout the afternoon. Careful whispers passed between those who had given testimony, a fragile current of hope moving beneath the household's usual tense stillness. Julian, sensing something amiss in the unusual quiet that had settled over the servants, attempted that afternoon to corner Nora near the kitchens, demanding to know what conversations had taken place with the Duke. "I have said nothing, sir," Nora insisted, though her trembling hands betrayed her fear. "You are lying. I can see it plainly enough. Please, sir, I have duties to attend to." He might have pressed further had Griggs not appeared in the corridor at that moment, offering some minor pretext to draw Julian's attention away, allowing Nora to slip past and disappear toward the safety of the kitchens. Julian's suspicion only deepened as the day wore on, though he remained uncertain exactly what was unfolding around him, a fact that left him irritable and short-tempered through the remaining hours before evening arrived. He requested that Lady Constance gather the full household in the main hall that evening, framing the request as a formality related to concluding his visit, a final courtesy before his departure the following morning. Lady Constance, suspecting nothing beyond routine farewells, agreed readily enough, pleased that his visit appeared to be drawing to its expected close without further complication. The household assembled as instructed, servants lining the edges of the grand hall in their evening duties, uncertain why their presence had been specifically requested for what should have been a private matter between the Duke and the estate's mistress. Elsie stood near the back, her heart pounding, aware of what was coming even as the rest of the household remained blissfully unaware. Lady Constance stood near the center of the hall in her finest evening dress, Julian at her side, both wearing expressions of polite, practiced welcome as Edmund entered. "Your Grace," Lady Constance said warmly, "I trust your business here has concluded satisfactorily." "It has concluded," Edmund said, his tone measured and even, giving no immediate indication of what was to follow, though perhaps not in the manner you anticipate. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Lady Constance's expression, quickly smoothed away beneath practiced composure. "I do not follow, your Grace. I came to this estate to settle a matter of boundary lines," Edmund said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled hall, drawing every eye toward him. "That matter has been settled, quietly, through correspondence with my own solicitors, but I find I cannot leave this place without addressing a far more serious matter, one that has come to my attention over the course of my stay." Lady Constance's smile remained fixed, though something rigid had entered her posture. "Whatever do you mean?" "I mean," Edmund said, "the systematic mistreatment of the servants under your care, the withheld wages, the physical punishment inflicted for offenses no greater than simple accident or honest defense of the vulnerable. I mean the treatment of a young woman named Elsie Cartwright, beaten 2 nights ago for the crime of saving an injured animal from being drowned by your son." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the assembled servants, though none dared speak aloud. Lady Constance's composure cracked visibly for the first time, color draining from her face before returning in a flush of indignant anger. "Your Grace, I do not know what tales have been carried to you, but I assure you, whatever discipline occurs within my household is a private matter, entirely within my rights as mistress of this estate." "Discipline," Edmund repeated, his voice hardening. "Is that what you call it? I have spoken with 6 members of your staff, Lady Constance. I have reviewed your household's financial records, comparing wages promised against wages actually paid over the past 2 years. I have seen, with my own eyes, the bruises left on a young woman's arms for the offense of showing mercy where you and your son showed none." Julian stepped forward, his face reddening. "You have no right to interfere in the private affairs of this household, whatever your title." "I have every right," Edmund said, turning his full attention toward the young man, his voice cold and controlled in a way that carried far more weight than shouting ever could. "Your family's estate carries obligations to my own, debts incurred by your late father that your mother has been quietly renegotiating for the past 3 years, debts that give me considerable influence over this household's continued financial standing. I have spent the better part of today ensuring those obligations are called due, in full, unless certain conditions are met immediately." Lady Constance's face had gone pale once more, the full weight of Edmund's words beginning to register. "You would ruin us over the discipline of servants?" "I would ruin no one who did not first choose cruelty over basic decency," Edmund said. "You have had years to run this household with fairness. Instead, you chose fear. You chose to withhold wages your staff earned honestly, to punish kindness as though it were crime, to build your comfort on the suffering of people who had no power to resist you. That choice has consequences, Lady Constance, and those consequences have now arrived." He gestured, and Griggs stepped forward from where he had been waiting near the hall's entrance, carrying the ledger Edmund had reviewed so carefully. Your own steward has confirmed the discrepancies in your household accounts. Wages reduced steadily, while your personal expenditures grew. This is not simply cruelty, Lady Constance. This is theft from those least able to demand justice for it. Griggs, Lady Constance said, her voice sharp with betrayal. How dare you? I dare, Griggs said, his voice trembling slightly, but holding steady. Because I have watched good people suffer under this roof for too long, myself included in my silence. I can no longer serve a household built on such foundations. Lady Constance turned back to Edmund, her expression shifting rapidly between anger and something closer to desperation as she recognized how thoroughly her position had crumbled. What is it you want, Your Grace? Money? An apology? Name your price and let us conclude this matter privately. I want, Edmund said, for this household to change, permanently and verifiably. I want every servant here paid the full wages owed to them, retroactive to the point these discrepancies began. I want written assurance, filed formally with the county magistrate, that physical punishment of staff will cease entirely, with independent oversight established to ensure compliance. And I want Elsie Cartwright, specifically, released from any further obligation to this household, free to seek employment elsewhere, with a character reference reflecting her true conduct rather than whatever fiction you might otherwise be inclined to write. Lady Constance's jaw tightened, humiliation and fury warring plainly across her features as she absorbed terms she had no real power to refuse. And if I decline these terms, then I call the debts due immediately, in full, and allow the magistrate to investigate the financial irregularities Mr. Griggs has documented so thoroughly. I suspect, given what has already come to light, such an investigation would not conclude favorably for either you or your son. The hall fell utterly silent, every servant present holding their breath as they watched the mistress who had ruled over them with such rigid control, finally facing consequences she could not simply order away. Julian's face had gone through several shades of red, his hands clenched at his sides, though he seemed to understand, even in his anger, that there was no path forward that did not end in his family's disgrace. You would humiliate us in front of our own staff, Julian said finally, his voice tight with barely contained fury. You humiliated yourselves, Edmund replied evenly. Long before I arrived, I am simply the one willing to say so aloud. Lady Constance's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, the fight visibly draining from her as the reality of her situation settled fully into place. She looked around the hall at the servants who had gathered, seeing perhaps for the first time in years the true extent of what her household had become, a collection of frightened, exhausted people who had learned to survive by making themselves invisible. Fine, she said finally, her voice quiet and clipped. Your terms will be met, Your Grace. I would like that in writing, witnessed by your steward, and delivered to the county magistrate's office by week's end, to ensure the arrangement carries proper legal weight. You have thought of everything, it seems. I have tried to, Edmund said, though I confess I take no satisfaction in any of this. I would have preferred to find this household run with the fairness its late master apparently once maintained. What I found instead was something far different, and I could not, in good conscience, leave it unaddressed. He turned toward Elsie then, who stood near the back of the hall, tears streaming silently down her face as she absorbed the full weight of what had just occurred before her. Elsie Cartwright, you are released from any further obligation to this household, effective immediately, with full wages owed to be paid before my departure tomorrow morning. Elsie could not find words immediately, overwhelmed by the sudden, dizzying shift from years of quiet endurance to this unexpected moment of vindication. The other servants around her began to murmur quietly among themselves, disbelief and cautious hope spreading through the assembled group as they began to understand the magnitude of what had just transpired. Julian, unable to contain his humiliation any longer, turned sharply and stormed from the hall without another word, his footsteps echoing harshly against the stone floor. Lady Constance remained standing a moment longer, her composure entirely gone now, before she too turned and left, her earlier confidence replaced by something far more brittle. The hall remained quiet for a long moment after their departure, the assembled servants unsure how to respond to a change so sudden and so complete. Then, slowly, Peter stepped forward from among the gathered staff, approaching Edmund with an expression of profound gratitude. Your Grace, I do not know how to properly thank you for what you have done here tonight. You need not thank me, Edmund said. You and everyone else in this hall showed remarkable courage in speaking the truth, despite considerable risk to yourselves. That courage deserves far more credit than anything I have done. Nora, standing nearby with tears still visible on her cheeks, added quietly, We did not believe anyone would ever listen, Your Grace, truly listen, and act on what they heard. Then I am glad to have proven that belief wrong, Edmund said gently. He made his way finally toward Elsie, who remained rooted near the back of the hall, still processing the enormity of what had just occurred. "It is finished," he said quietly, once he stood before her. "You need not fear this household any longer." "I do not know what to say, Your Grace," Elsie managed, her voice thick with emotion. "You have given me back a life I had nearly given up hoping for." "You gave yourself that life," Edmund said, "the moment you chose to save a helpless creature despite knowing the cost. I merely ensured that choice was finally honored rather than punished." Around them, the household staff began to disperse slowly, murmuring quietly among themselves, the weight of years finally beginning to lift from a household that had, until tonight, known only fear as its governing principle. Some embraced one another openly, tears mixing with tentative, disbelieving laughter, while others simply stood in stunned silence, unable yet to fully accept that the world they had known for so long had genuinely changed. Mrs. Bramwell, the housekeeper who had so often been ordered to carry out Lady Constance's punishments, approached Elsie hesitantly, her expression carrying a mixture of shame and relief. "I am sorry," she said quietly, "for every time I was made to hurt you. I told myself I had no choice, but I see now I could have done more to resist it." "You were as trapped as the rest of us," Elsie said, and though her voice still trembled with emotion, there was no bitterness in it, only a weary understanding earned through years of shared hardship. "I do not blame you, Mrs. Bramwell. None of us chose the fear that ruled this house." Griggs moved carefully among the gathered staff, already beginning to discuss practical matters, the wages soon to be restored, the written agreement that would need to be drafted and witnessed before the Duke's departure. His earlier anxiety had transformed into something like quiet purpose, a man finally able to act openly on principles he had been forced to suppress for far too long. Edmund watched the scene unfold around him for a while longer, satisfied that the change he had set in motion would hold, reinforced now by written agreement and legal obligation, rather than resting on Lady Constance's uncertain goodwill alone. He made his way finally toward Elsie, who remained rooted near the back of the hall, still processing the enormity of what had just occurred. "It is finished," he said quietly, once he stood before her. "You need not fear this household any longer." "I do not know what to say, Your Grace," Elsie managed, her voice thick with emotion. "You have given me back a life I had nearly given up hoping for." "You gave yourself that life," Edmund said, "the moment you chose to save a helpless creature despite knowing the cost. I merely ensured that choice was finally honored rather than punished. What will become of me now? I have no family, no other position arranged." "That," Edmund said, with something almost like a smile touching his otherwise serious expression, "is a matter I hope we might discuss further, once the immediate business here has concluded properly." Elsie looked at him with cautious curiosity, uncertain exactly what he meant, though something in his tone eased the anxious uncertainty that had begun creeping back into her thoughts. Around them, the household staff began to disperse slowly, murmuring quietly among themselves, the weight of years finally beginning to lift from a household that had, until tonight, known only fear as its governing principle. Somewhere beyond the hall, in the quiet of the barn, Copper waited patiently for Elsie's return, unaware of how thoroughly the world around him had just changed for the better, unaware that the small, desperate cry he had once let out in a rainstorm had ultimately brought an entire household's cruelty crashing down. The morning after the confrontation in the great hall arrived bright and clear, the storm that had marked Elsie's first encounter with Copper now long past, leaving the estate grounds washed clean beneath pale autumn sunlight. Elsie woke earlier than usual, though for the first time in years, it was not fear that pulled her from sleep, but a strange, unfamiliar lightness she barely recognized as hope. She found Copper waiting for her in the barn, his injured leg healing steadily beneath its careful bandaging, his tail wagging with an enthusiasm that seemed entirely undiminished by his ordeal. He hobbled toward her as best he could, and she knelt to scoop him gently into her arms, laughing softly for what felt like the first time in longer than she could remember. "We survived it," she murmured into his fur. "Both of us." Word had already spread quickly through the household staff overnight, the written agreement Edmund had demanded now being carefully drafted in the estate's study under Griggs's watchful supervision. Lady Constance had retreated to her private apartments following the previous evening's confrontation, emerging only briefly to sign the documents placed before her, her earlier composure replaced by a brittle, exhausted resignation. Julian had not been seen at all since storming from the hall, though servants passing near his rooms reported the sound of furniture being overturned in the early hours of the morning, evidence of a temper that had finally been forced to confront consequences it could no longer simply dismiss. Edmund spent the morning finalizing the practical details of the arrangement, ensuring wages owed were calculated precisely and prepared for distribution before his departure. He reviewed the written agreement personally, checking every clause against the promises made the previous evening, determined that nothing would be left vague enough for Lady Constance to exploit once his own presence no longer enforced compliance. "The magistrate's office has confirmed receipt of our correspondence, Your Grace," Griggs reported, finding Edmund in the study shortly before midday. "An independent inspector will visit the estate quarterly to ensure the terms are being honored. Lady Constance has been made fully aware of the consequences should any violation be discovered." "Good," Edmund said. "And the wages?" "Calculated and ready for distribution this afternoon, Your Grace. Exactly as promised. I have never seen the staff so eager to complete their morning duties. There is an energy in this house today unlike anything I have witnessed in years." Edmund allowed himself a small measure of satisfaction at this report, though he remained aware that his work here, while significant, addressed only one household among countless others where similar cruelties likely continued unchecked. It was a thought that would stay with him long after he departed Merrick Estate, one that would eventually shape decisions he made regarding his own influence and responsibilities in the years ahead. He found Elsie later that afternoon near the barn, Copper resting contentedly nearby in a patch of warm sunlight, while she packed the few belongings she owned into a small, worn bag. "You are leaving already?" Edmund asked, though he had known this moment was approaching. "I have nowhere else arranged yet, Your Grace, but I could not bear to remain here a moment longer than necessary, whatever agreements have been signed. Too many memories linger in these walls." "I understand entirely," Edmund said, "which is why I wish to speak with you before you depart." Elsie paused in her packing, looking up at him with cautious curiosity. "Your Grace? I mentioned last night that I hoped we might discuss your future further, once the immediate matters here were settled. I would like to offer you a position within my own household, if you are willing to consider it." "What sort of position, Your Grace?" "My own housekeeper has been seeking an assistant for some time now, someone reliable and capable of managing the household's daily affairs alongside her. Based on everything I have witnessed of your character these past days, your resourcefulness, your compassion, your quiet strength even under considerable hardship, I believe you would excel in such a role. The wages would be fair, the treatment respectful, and Copper, of course, would be entirely welcome." Elsie stared at him, momentarily unable to find words adequate to the offer before her. "Your Grace, I do not know how to properly express my gratitude for such an opportunity." "You need not express anything beyond your honest answer," Edmund said. "I do not offer this out of pity, Elsie. I offer it because I believe you would genuinely excel in the role, and because I would be glad to have someone of your character within my own household." "Then yes," Elsie said, her voice steadying with each word, disbelief slowly giving way to genuine, cautious joy. "I accept, Your Grace, with more gratitude than I can properly express." "Then it is settled," Edmund said, something warm entering his usually measured expression. "We depart within the hour, if you are prepared." The remaining preparations passed quickly, Elsie saying brief, emotional farewells to the servants who had become something like family through years of shared hardship. Peter embraced her warmly, wishing her well with genuine happiness despite the tears visible in his eyes. Nora hugged her tightly, promising to write once she had settled into whatever new position she herself would soon seek, now freed from the fear that had previously kept her rooted in place. Mrs. Bramwell offered a quiet, sincere apology once more, which Elsie accepted with the same weary grace she had shown the night before. Lady Constance did not appear to offer any farewell, remaining secluded in her apartments as the carriage was prepared for departure. Julian appeared briefly near the stables as Elsie carried her small bag toward the waiting carriage, his expression sullen and resentful, though he said nothing, apparently having learned, at least for now, the cost of voicing his displeasure too openly. As the carriage pulled away from Merrick Estate, Elsie watched through the small window as the grand house grew smaller behind them, years of hardship and fear shrinking away with each passing mile. Copper sat contentedly in her lap, his injured leg healing well enough now that he could bear weight on it again, his small body warm against her as the countryside rolled past beyond the glass. "Are you well?" Edmund asked, watching her carefully from across the carriage. "I believe I am, Your Grace, truly well, for the first time in longer than I can remember." The journey to Holloway Estate took the better part of 2 days, and Elsie found herself, with each passing mile, allowing herself to imagine a future she had never dared consider possible before. She thought of the years ahead, free from the constant fear that had governed her existence at Merrick Estate, free to build a life defined by her own choices, rather than someone else's cruelty. Holloway Estate, when they finally arrived, proved everything Edmund had described and more. The household staff greeted him with genuine warmth entirely unlike the careful, fearful deference she had witnessed at her former home. The housekeeper, a kind woman named Margaret Hale, welcomed Elsie with immediate warmth, showing her to comfortable quarters and outlining her new duties with patient thoroughness that made clear, from the very first conversation, that this household operated on entirely different principles than the one she had left behind. In the weeks that followed, Elsie settled gradually into her new life, learning her responsibilities with the same careful diligence she had always brought to her work, though now without the constant undercurrent of fear that had previously shadowed every task. Copper healed fully, his limp fading until it disappeared entirely, and he became something of a beloved fixture around the estate grounds, greeted warmly by staff and family alike wherever he wandered. Margaret Hale proved a patient and generous teacher, walking Elsie through the particular rhythms of Halloway Estate with none of the sharp impatience Elsie had grown accustomed to enduring under Lady Constance's rule. When Elsie made a small error during her first week, misplacing a set of linens intended for the guest quarters, Margaret simply corrected her gently and moved on, without punishment, without lingering resentment, as though mistakes were simply an ordinary part of learning, rather than offenses to be remembered and held against her. "You flinch," Margaret observed one afternoon, several weeks into Elsie's employment, after Elsie had instinctively braced herself upon dropping a small dish in the kitchen. "There is no need for that here, dear. We do not punish accidents in this house." "I am sorry," Elsie said quickly. "Old habits still difficult to shed entirely. It will take time, I think, to unlearn certain expectations." "Take all the time you need," Margaret said kindly. "I have heard something of where you came from, and I imagine such habits do not disappear overnight. You are safe here, whatever your instincts may still tell you." Slowly, over the following weeks and months, Elsie found those old instincts beginning to ease, replaced gradually by a growing confidence in her own judgment and abilities. She took genuine pride in her work, learning the management of linens and provisions, the coordination of the household's daily rhythms, skills that came naturally to her once fear no longer clouded every decision she made. The other staff at Halloway Estate welcomed her warmly as well, curious about her history but respectful enough not to press for details she was not yet ready to share. Edmund, though occupied with his own considerable responsibilities managing his estate and broader affairs throughout the county, found himself checking in on Elsie's progress with a frequency that surprised even himself. Their conversations, initially limited to practical matters concerning her duties, gradually expanded into longer discussions covering everything from household management to books they had each read, from memories of childhood to hopes for the future neither had previously felt free enough to voice aloud. Word eventually reached Halloway Estate, some months later, that Merrick Estate had undergone significant change in the time since Elsie's departure. The independent inspections continued as promised, and though Lady Constance remained resentful of the arrangement forced upon her, she had apparently learned enough caution to maintain the terms, rather than risk the full consequences Edmund had threatened. Several of the servants who had remained, including Peter and Nora, wrote occasionally to Elsie, describing a household slowly, cautiously improving, though it would clearly take considerable time to fully heal from the years of fear that had shaped it. Nearly a year after Elsie's arrival at Halloway Estate, on a clear autumn evening not unlike the one that had marked the beginning of everything, Edmund found her in the estate's gardens, Copper resting nearby as she tended carefully to a small bed of flowers she had planted earlier that season. "You have made quite a home for yourself here," he observed, settling onto the bench beside her. "I have," Elsie agreed, brushing dirt from her hands as she looked up at him. "More than I ever dared hope for, Your Grace." "Edmund," he corrected gently, as he had taken to doing more frequently in recent months. "I believe, after all this time, you might allow yourself that familiarity, at least when we are alone." "Edmund, then," Elsie said, testing the name with a small, genuine smile. They sat together for a while in comfortable silence, watching the last light of evening fade slowly across the gardens, Copper dozing contentedly at their feet. It was Edmund who finally spoke again, his voice carrying a quiet seriousness that drew Elsie's full attention. "I have watched you these past months, Elsie, and I find myself increasingly certain of something I had not expected to discover when I first arrived at Merrick Estate, seeking only to settle a matter of boundary lines. Your courage that first night, your resilience through everything that followed, the quiet strength you have shown in building a new life for yourself here. These qualities have earned my genuine admiration, and, I find, something considerably deeper than admiration alone." Elsie's breath caught slightly, hardly daring to hope she understood his meaning correctly. "Your Grace, Edmund, what are you saying?" "I am saying," Edmund said, taking her hand gently in his own, "that I have come to care for you deeply, Elsie Cartwright, not simply as someone I once helped, but as a woman I have come to know and admire in her own right. I do not offer this admission lightly, nor do I expect any immediate answer if you require time to consider it. But I could not continue watching the seasons pass without finally speaking the truth of my own heart. Tears gathered in Elsie's eyes, though this time they carried none of the pain that had marked so many tears before them, only overwhelming gratitude and a joy she had never permitted herself to imagine possible. I care for you as well, Edmund, more deeply than I believed I was still capable of feeling, after everything. Their courtship, once begun, unfolded gently and without hurry, built on the genuine foundation of respect and understanding, established through everything they had already weathered together. They walked the estate gardens most evenings when Edmund's duties allowed it, talking of small things and large ones alike, Elsie gradually shedding the careful reserve she had carried for so long, allowing herself, perhaps for the first time in her life, to simply be seen and valued, exactly as she was. Some members of county society, upon learning of the Duke's growing attachment to a former servant girl, whispered disapprovingly behind closed doors, questioning whether such a match befit a man of his standing. Edmund paid such whispers little mind, having long ago decided that character mattered a great deal more to him than circumstance of birth, and Elsie, having already survived far harsher judgment than idle gossip, found she could bear such murmurs with quiet, unbothered grace. Margaret Hale, observing the growing bond between them with evident approval, once remarked to Elsie that she had rarely seen the Duke smile so freely as he did in her company, a comment that brought warm color to Elsie's cheeks and a happiness she still sometimes found difficult to fully trust. So unfamiliar was it after years spent expecting hardship rather than joy. When Edmund proposed formally, months later, in the same garden where their understanding had first been spoken aloud, kneeling before her with a small ring that had belonged to his own mother, Elsie accepted without hesitation, tears of genuine happiness slipping freely down her cheeks, as Copper barked joyfully nearby, circling them both as though he too understood the full significance of the moment unfolding before him. They were married the following spring, a quiet, joyful ceremony attended by the full staff of Halloway Estate, along with Peter and Nora, who traveled from Merrick Estate especially for the occasion, genuine happiness radiating from every corner of the celebration. Elsie stood before the gathered guests not as a frightened servant girl who had once hidden in fear of punishment, but as a woman who had found, through her own courage and the recognition of a man willing to see her true worth, a life entirely transformed from the one she had once known. Copper, now fully grown and thoroughly spoiled by the entire household, sat proudly at the edge of the ceremony, a living reminder of the small act of kindness that had ultimately changed everything, proof that even the smallest choice to show mercy, made in the depths of a storm, could ripple outward into a future neither Elsie nor Edmund could have fully imagined when their paths first crossed on that rain-soaked evening at Merrick Estate. 2 years into their marriage, Elsie and Edmund welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Margaret after the housekeeper who had shown Elsie such patient kindness during her earliest days at Halloway Estate. The baby arrived on a mild spring morning, and Edmund, who had faced boundary disputes and household confrontations with unshakable composure, found himself pacing the halls outside the birthing room, with an anxiety that amused the household staff greatly, though none dared say so openly until the healthy cries of his new daughter finally reached his ears. Elsie took to motherhood with the same quiet determination she had brought to every challenge in her life before it, and Copper, now older and considerably more settled than the frightened, injured creature she had once rescued from a rainstorm, appointed himself the child's devoted guardian, rarely straying far from the nursery whenever the baby slept. Word of Elsie's happiness eventually found its way back to Merrick Estate through the continued correspondence she maintained with Peter and Nora, both of whom remained in service there, though under conditions considerably improved from what they had once endured. Peter wrote that Lady Constance, though still cold and reserved in her dealings with the staff, no longer resorted to the physical punishments that had once defined her household's daily rhythm, kept carefully in check by the quarterly inspections Edmund had insisted upon during that final confrontation. Julian, according to Nora's letters, had grown increasingly restless under the constraints placed on the estate, eventually departing for an extended stay with distant relatives, apparently unable to reconcile himself to a household he no longer felt entitled to rule as he once had. Nora herself had since married a young farmer from a neighboring village, her letters filled with a lightness and hope that had been entirely absent during her years at Merrick Estate, a transformation Elsie recognized easily, having experienced something remarkably similar in her own life since Edmund's intervention. Peter remained at the estate by choice, feeling a responsibility to the younger staff who still looked to him for guidance, determined to ensure the improvements achieved would not quietly erode once enough time had passed for old habits to reassert themselves. Edmund, for his part, had not forgotten the broader lesson Merrick Estate had taught him, that cruelty hidden behind respectable walls could persist for years without consequence, unless someone with sufficient influence chose to look closely enough to see it. In the years following his marriage, he became known throughout the county for a quiet but persistent advocacy on behalf of household staff more broadly, using his position to encourage fairer wages and more humane treatment among the estates within his circle of influence, never through public spectacle, but through the same careful, deliberate methods he had employed at Merrick Estate, methods that proved, time and again, remarkably effective at achieving lasting change. One particular case, several years into their marriage, brought the couple's shared commitment to fairness into sharp focus once more. A neighboring landowner, known throughout the county for his harsh treatment of tenant farmers, found himself facing similar scrutiny after Edmund quietly gathered evidence of exploitative practices affecting families who had worked his land for generations. Elsie, drawing on her own experience, suggested that Edmund approach the matter not merely through financial leverage, but by ensuring the affected families themselves had a voice in whatever resolution followed. A suggestion Edmund readily embraced, recognizing in it the same wisdom that had guided their own beginning. "They know their circumstances better than any outsider could," Elsie told him one evening, as they discussed the matter over a quiet dinner. "Let them speak for themselves, as I once did, rather than simply deciding on their behalf what justice should look like." Edmund took her counsel seriously, and the resolution that followed proved more durable and more genuinely fair than anything achieved through financial pressure alone, a pattern the couple would repeat in various forms throughout the years that followed, their partnership extending naturally into shared purpose beyond the walls of their own household. Margaret Hale, still serving as housekeeper at Halloway Estate, though now assisted capably by Elsie in nearly every aspect of the household's management, often remarked with evident pride that she had never seen a household run with such genuine warmth as the one Elsie had helped shape in the years since her arrival. Young servants who joined the staff spoke openly of feeling valued, rather than merely tolerated, a distinction Elsie understood more deeply than most, having spent so many years on the opposite side of that particular divide. When their daughter grew old enough to understand simple stories, Elsie often told her, in gentle, careful terms suited to a child's understanding, about the small dog who had once needed saving during a terrible storm, and about the kind stranger who had noticed a small kindness and refused to let it go unrewarded. She never dwelled on the harder details of those years, choosing instead to emphasize the lesson she herself had carried forward from everything she had endured, that courage, however small it might seem in the moment, could ripple outward in ways no one could fully predict. Copper lived a long and thoroughly contented life at Halloway Estate, growing old alongside the family he had unknowingly brought together, his once injured leg fully healed, though he retained, even in his later years, a slight favoring of that side whenever the weather turned particularly cold, a small reminder of the storm that had first brought Elsie to his side. He became a beloved fixture throughout the household, greeting each new addition to the family with the same gentle warmth he had shown from those very first days in the barn, and when he finally passed peacefully in his sleep many years later, the entire household mourned him as they might have mourned a member of the family itself, which in every meaningful sense he had long since become. Elsie never forgot the fear that had once ruled so much of her early life, nor did she allow herself to forget the courage it had taken to finally speak her truth aloud in that quiet, candlelit study so many years before. She often reflected, in quiet moments alone in the gardens she had come to love so dearly, on how easily that rainy evening might have unfolded differently, how easily she might have walked past the small, desperate cry rather than stopping to investigate it, how easily Edmund might have overlooked the bruise on her wrist rather than pausing to ask a simple, kind question that changed the entire course of her life. She understood, with the clarity that only comes from having lived through genuine hardship, that kindness offered freely, without expectation of reward, carried a power all its own, one that could not always be measured immediately, but that rippled outward regardless, touching lives in ways neither the giver nor the receiver could ever fully anticipate. It was a lesson she carried with her always, woven into every aspect of how she chose to run her own household, how she chose to raise her children, and how she chose to treat every person who crossed her path, regardless of their station or circumstance. She made certain, too, that her own staff at Halloway Estate never forgot the particular value of speaking honestly, even when honesty felt dangerous. She kept an open door, quite literally, for any member of the household who wished to raise a concern, remembering keenly how many years had passed before anyone had offered her the same simple courtesy. Young maids who arrived nervous and uncertain, having perhaps heard stories of harsher households elsewhere, often remarked, after a few months in service, that they had never imagined a position could feel so entirely free of fear. Edmund, watching his wife build this culture of openness and respect throughout their household, often reflected that she had accomplished something he himself, for all his influence and resources, could never have achieved alone. His intervention at Merrick Estate had ended one particular instance of cruelty, but Elsie's quiet daily example, sustained over years rather than delivered in a single dramatic confrontation, had built something that would likely outlast them both. A standard of decency passed down through every servant who learned their trade under her patient guidance, many of whom would eventually carry those same values into households of their own. Years later, when her own daughter Margaret had grown into a thoughtful young woman with her mother's quiet strength and her father's steady sense of justice, Elsie found herself telling the full story at last, without softening its harder edges, wanting her daughter to understand not only the joy that had eventually followed, but the genuine courage it had required to survive the years that came before it. "Why did you not simply give up hope, Mother?" her daughter asked one evening, having listened intently to the full account for the first time. "After everything you endured?" Elsie considered the question carefully before answering, drawing on years of reflection to find the truest possible response. "Because somewhere, even in my darkest moments, I believed that kindness still mattered, that it was still worth the risk, even when the cost seemed impossibly high. I could not have known, that night in the rain, that saving a small, frightened creature would eventually lead me to your father, to you, to this entire life I now cherish so deeply. But I knew, in that moment, that walking away would have meant losing something essential in myself, something I was not willing to sacrifice, whatever the consequences might prove to be." Her daughter considered this thoughtfully, the same quiet wisdom that had guided Elsie through her own hardest years, already visible in her expression. "I am glad you did not walk away, Mother." "So am I," Elsie said softly, drawing her daughter into a gentle embrace as evening settled peacefully over the gardens of Holloway Estate. "So am I, more than words could ever properly express." And so the story that had begun in fear and cruelty, on a rain-soaked evening beside a broken woodpile, found its true and lasting conclusion, not in the confrontation that had exposed old wrongs, nor even in the wedding that had followed, but in the quiet, ordinary happiness of a life built steadily afterward, one kindness at a time, proving in the end that even the smallest act of mercy could echo forward through generations, transforming not only the life it had first touched, but every life that came after it as well.